Hello, welcome back to the David Kurten Show. This is today's News Talk, TNT, and I am absolutely delighted to have with me today on the show Jay Bhattacharya, who is a professor of health policy at Stanford University in California, USA, and also is well known as one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was so good in bringing attention to the horrors of a blanket lockdown which was imposed around the world. Professor Bhattacharya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, David. It's a delight to be on.
I thank you so much for coming. And I know that you wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, which was fantastic. When did you start to realize that the whole lockdown scenario that was being imposed on everyone was something that was wrong?
I mean, that was my first reaction to when I first heard of lockdown in March of 2020. At that time, there were certain scientific facts I didn't know. I thought nobody knew, which is how deadly and widespread were the disease already at the time. And so I did some studies, and that led me to. I knew about the harms of lockdown. The only question in my mind was maybe it might have worked. But those scientific findings led me to the conclusion that the disease was actually already quite widespread by April of 2020. And certainly by October of 2020, when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, the harms of lockdown far outweighed the putative benefits, of which there seemed to be none.
Mm. Yeah, I would have said the same thing. I mean, in the UK, we had this man, Professor Ferguson, and he did what I would call some dodgy modelling. And he said to the MPs in Parliament, if you don't lock down, 520,000 people in the UK are going to die. But on the day that they pushed that through the Parliament, he actually changed his modelling and said, oh, no, it's not going to be 520,000 people. It'll only be 50,000 people. But by then it was too late. They'd all gone away on their holiday. And the rest is history. And then the lockdown was in place. I mean, did you have any similar kind of dodgy modeling back then in the USA, but also through the years as we've gone on?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that same modeler had a model for the United States. The Imperial College model of Neil Ferguson estimated that 2 million people would die within 2 or 3 months of unless lockdown happened. I actually personally spoke with President Trump in July of 2020 or August of 2020, and he told me that essentially that's what he was told, that if he did not lock down the United States of America, 2 million people would die. That model had a tremendous effect on the minds of politicians absolutely everywhere. And if you look and see, okay, was it really dodgy? Here's how you can see it was dodgy. The model predicted, the implication of the model was that I think something like 100,000 people would die in Sweden within a month or two unless they locked down in April of 2020 or March of 2020. Of course, Sweden didn't lock down and they didn't have 100,000 deaths within a month. When you have a fact contradict a theory, the theory dies, the fact wins.
Indeed, yeah. Then you made the Great Barrington Declaration, which was a really great statement of why we shouldn't do this. We should just protect the vulnerable, the people that were perhaps most susceptible from COVID, from getting severe symptoms, but let everybody else get on with their lives. But there was a lot of hostility to that, which was incredibly surprising, given that there'd already been 6 months of data and everyone could probably see that this was not working. The lockdowns weren't working. I think you were called a fringe epidemiologist by some people in power. Were you surprised at the hostility to you and your fellow professors in writing the Great Barrington Declaration?
I mean, I knew there would be some hostility from some corners. What I didn't expect was that the most like the sort of the central authorities, people like Tony Fauci or the head of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, who wrote that infamous email calling me and Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff fringe epidemiologists. I didn't expect that. I expected a constructive engagement because we were pointing something out that was absolutely true, that there were children, poor people, working class, vast numbers of people really harmed by lockdown. It seemed like they didn't care about the well-being and health of those people at all. And furthermore, you're absolutely right, David. The idea that the lockdowns had worked, well, I mean, look, the disease had spread everywhere despite the lockdowns in early 2020, certainly all through Europe and all through North America and all through South America and all through South Asia. Every place that had any semblance of a lockdown, I mean, you could squint and say, oh, it worked in the South Pacific on remote islands, but it didn't work anywhere in the developed world or much of the developing world. So yeah, the lockdowns really had failed to actually protect people against COVID. And we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration to encourage more creative thinking about how best to protect vulnerable older people. But unfortunately, the center rejected that idea.
Today there still seems to be some pressure from some people to bring back another lockdown. There's also some people who had that at the time. They loved the power that it gave them. And we continually hear new narratives of monkeypox and Alaska pox this week, and there may be bubonic plague in Oregon. It seems that people are trying to talk up these things so that they can bring in these measures again. I mean, did you think there's any danger of there being another lockdown scenario with people trying to manufacture this and bring it in again?
I think that there's quite a danger of that. In fact, I think that lockdown is the standard now for how we think about managing large-scale respiratory virus threats. I think that many people who, I mean, I don't know that they necessarily started this way, but they benefited from lockdown. There was a massive upward transfer of wealth, huge amounts of power, of course, gained by politicians who locked down. You know, it was popular to lock down in 2020. And it was fear, as you rightly point out, as the basis of that. It is very likely that this is the standard template. And so, if, for instance, if you are, it's very likely that in your future, your children will be locked out of school at some point if there's another set of facts that something like what happened. That the template for lockdown is, I think, set in place.
What do we have to do to break that thinking, to break that model? Because clearly it isn't the right thing. It didn't work. You've done lots of work on it. Lots of other people have done lots of work. We've got data. We know that it doesn't work now, because an epidemic spreads so quickly normally that by the time you actually do something like a lockdown, it's too late, like you said. I mean, but as you say, that the people that like the idea, they either benefit from it financially or they benefit from it socially. I mean, you have, the people who work in the civil service in the government, they can all go home and work on their laptops and they can have a whale of a time just being at home. They don't have to commute. They can work shorter hours and they still get paid for it. But normal people still have to go out and work. If you're a working man or a working woman, you fix people's plumbing or you deliver things, you still have to go out to work. It seems to me that you've got this class of people, like you say, who benefit from it. How do we get the upper hand over them?
I think one thing is that they're not the majority of the population. The vast majority of the population, say 70% of the population, do not have any benefit at all from lockdown, just harm. And so they're not the majority. The unfortunate fact is that they have a political majority in many places. There doesn't seem to be a political coalition that cleanly says we should not lock down. I think that political movements throughout the West ought to embrace this idea that public health responses ought to have a measure to them. They shouldn't be uniformly focused on one threat, but they should take the health of all people and all public health, all health threats seriously. That they should consider cost and benefits. That the decisions should not be made by a relatively small group of scientists. We should reestablish scientific debate and discussion at the centerpiece of this kind of decision making. These should all become part of a political movement. It has to be, because the way we live our lives, politics is supposed to help with that. It's supposed to set us free from the kind of authoritarian power that we saw during the pandemic, not a subject to us to it. And it's become very clear that public health has the opposite orientation. So I think political movements everywhere should be forced to embrace the idea that this authoritarian power should never be used again against us the way it was during the pandemic.
I totally agree. And obviously, I'm in the UK. I've set up the Heritage Party. I set it up at the very beginning of the lockdown period, and we've got a specific policy that there would be no more lockdowns, and there should be no coercion to take what I call experimental injections, sometimes called vaccines. And everyone should have medical autonomy. And I think we embrace that. There are political parties in a number of countries that do that. How about in the United States? I mean, have you got any specific party? I mean, you're really stuck with two big parties, so you don't have much of a choice there. But how is there a political movement there in the USA to create some policy or movement in the political sphere which would be against any kind of lockdowns happening in the future?
I think within both political parties, there are substantial movements along those lines, although neither, I think, yet have the upper hand. In the Republican Party, for instance, this is embodied, I think, by Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who opposed lockdowns and worked very hard to dismantle them within his state. In the Democratic Party, there is RFK Jr., I think that's the presidential candidate, the Democratic presidential candidate. Unfortunately, the most powerful politician in the United States, President Biden, seems completely in line with the lockdown idea, and it's just unfortunate because I think a lot of the Democratic Party has gone along with that. But in the Republican Party, you had President Trump, who's kind of ambiguous about this. He seems, on the one hand, he's obviously been very skeptical of lockdown. He certainly at the time it seemed that way, even though he imposed them. But at the same time, I think he's reluctant to admit that the decisions that he made about the lockdowns were the wrong ones. And so within both political parties, it seems like there's a fight going on over the future of public health.
Yeah. What's your opinion of the vaccines or injections, if you like, that came in after lockdowns? They were touted as by some people as a way out. My personal opinion is that they should never have been postulated as something because they didn't have any long-term safety testing. But what's your opinion of those things?
Well, I think it's subtle and complicated. So for one, I think the idea that we should lock down would never have been embraced if the possibility of having a product like the mRNA vaccines or the AstraZeneca vaccine had not been on the horizon, because people would have said, "Oh, there's no way out," right? So even just the very presence of the technology enabled people to want to lock down, right? To even entertain as an idea. And now I think that's partly why the lockdown ideology is enshrined, is that, oh, we have this technology, within just a few months we can develop it. Why not lock down until we get the new vaccine? That's what will happen in the next big pandemic. So I think in that sense, there's a negative there. There is also a hope. What if it had worked? What if it had been a completely safe vaccine with no side effects that had stopped transmission, right? So that's certainly a good thing. Everybody would like that. But the thing that you point out is absolutely the most important thing. And this is true not just for these vaccines, it's true for every vaccine. Every vaccine has potential side effects that takes a long time to learn about. There's processes for learning about them over time, by you use them on first on very, small populations. The more you learn about them, if it works well in those populations, you expand out. It's a more conservative process for learning about vaccine use. Here, during the pandemic, all of that gets thrown aside, and there's tremendous pressure to force people to take this as an experiment, even before we know a lot about the long-term safety data. And I think that's what happened here. There were a number of promises made about this vaccine, about its efficacy and its safety, that turned out not to be true. Specifically, the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting or spreading COVID. That turned out to be a lie. And many, many mandates were put in their place, and many people lost their jobs and careers over this idea. And certainly there were side effects. Young men got myocarditis at, I think, at unacceptably high rates. 1 in 5,000, I don't know, whatever it is, it's too high for the benefit that they got from the vaccine. So I think a lot of it is just it's a mix of both promise and also tragedy. And as a consequence, a lot of people have lost faith in vaccines that are safe and effective. And I think it's just very unfortunate.
I mean, this brings into a wider question, but I have a science background as well. I'm not as much of an eminent scientist as you, but I'm actually shocked at how science, the process of science, the normal scientific method has been completely undermined over the whole COVID and injection period. Do you have concerns about that as well? I mean, you've seen science just changed and become politicized and beholden to ideologies rather than people actually trying to find out, observed empirical facts and data. What's your opinion of that?
David, unfortunately, I think we are in a new dark age. We are in an age where a man at the top of the scientific bureaucracy, Tony Fauci, can unironically say to the public that if you contradict me, you're not simply questioning a man, you are questioning science itself. I mean, imagine the hubris of that, to think of himself as the Pope of science, and then be taken seriously by scientists and by the public at large. Um, that's a new dark age, an age where science will brook no opposition, will not permit no debate. There's just orthodoxy and heresy, and I think that is a major problem for science generally.
Yeah, it is an absolute shock. I can't stand this, and I really hate the way that science has been undermined. Look, Jay Bhattacharya, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'd love to have you back on the show again, but this is all we got time for today. This is today's News Talk, TNT. Thanks for joining me.